Friends, welcome to another round of This is Crucial Conversations. It's good to see your face, Amos, my bestie, my dear friend over there in Dallas. Hello from Berkeley. What is up?
Nothing much. Good to be back here for This is Crucial again.
Yeah, I feel like in the past week or 2 weeks, ever since Labor Day, the world has been gearing up to return to something that honestly seems like pre-pandemic times, a lot of hustle, a lot of bustle. And yet in the midst of it all, it's important to stop and continue to focus in on these conversations that are crucial. They impact our human relationships, our human existence, our understanding of God and our place in the world. And so we're excited about the lineup that we have for y'all this year and excited to be using our fancy new microphones.
Yes. Can you hear the
depth of bass in my voice?
That's the reason why we bought these new microphones was to make the bass more prominent. This is what you're going to hear today on This is Crucial is a conversation with one of our guests for the fall. Before we get there, though, I just want to take a quick moment and share about how we're expanding the conversation here at This is Crucial. We've been focused on healing justice and issues around racism since this podcast started 2 years ago. This coming fall and spring, we are going to expand the conversation to touch on issues that relate to and are connected to healing justice and racism, but may not be expressly about racism itself. So looking forward to in sharing the platform we've got here with some of our guests and learning more from them.
So yeah, we acknowledge and affirm that we are more than just the colors of our skin. We are also our genders, our sexualities, the places we come from, the economics in which we are living in and subsisting in and surviving in. And so we want to bring that into the conversation, which makes our first guest for the fall so perfect. Jeff Chu is an example of how this intersectionality of all of our identities really comes into play in our everyday life and existence. So Jeff Chu is the co-curator and co-host of Evolving Faith, along with his friend Sarah Bessie. It's a community for those who find themselves in the church, in a gap in the church that is becoming and the church that was. And it's those who maybe their full stories and identities and narratives haven't always been included and honored by the church. I know that's something that resonates with me. He is a teacher and a preacher and a gardener and a farmer. And in his former life and also in his current life, he is and was a journalist. He currently serves as the editor-at-large at Travel and Leisure. He's written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and was on staff at Time Magazine for many years. That's actually how I came to know of Jeff Chu. He was writing about the church, and I resonated with the way that he approached the conversation and had the honor of meeting him and becoming friends with him over the years as he coincided with many of my friends at Princeton Theological Seminary. Jeff and his husband and their dog Fozzie live in Michigan right now, where he is a candidate within the RCA tradition. And so it is my joy and pleasure to welcome Jeff Chu as our September guest. And you all can hear more about his community Evolving Faith and the conference that they're putting on in just a few weeks in October. So without further ado, let's welcome Jeff Chu. So this first episode of This is Crucial for this year is so exciting for me because we get to talk to somebody who I often wonder, how did I get so lucky to be his friend? I've long known about Jeff Chu far before I even met him. I read his works in Time Magazine. I knew of his books. I had friends of his who told me what an amazing person he was. And it all is even better in real life when I get to know Jeff.
Lies.
No, all truths. And so what I love about, if you Google Jeff Chu, the number of qualifiers that come up about who you are. Jeff Chu is journalist, interviewer, curator, writer, reporter, preacher, teacher, farmer, great little interviewer, husband, partner, all of these amazing things, which, and hopefully this will come out in our conversation. For us as Asian Americans, it's kind of weird just to hear all of these titles put on ourselves. It actually is maybe even uncomfortable. And so for you as Jeff Chu, how do all of these titles feel for you? And how would you describe yourself to someone who doesn't even know you?
I'm honestly not super big on the titles. I think there is something in American society where we're often defined by what we do, not by who we are. I remember reading that Walt Whitman poem, Song of America, I think it is. Every single person in that poem is defined by their job. Right? And I've had a lot of different jobs. So hearing you read off the list of titles is maybe part like hearing my resume read, but part like hearing a eulogy as if I've died. But I don't think anybody's titles ever capture the entirety of who they are and what they care about and what drives them and what their heart longs for, right? So who I am, I'm just a normal person trying to make sense of a wild world. I'm trying to sort out what my story is and can be and how it intersects with my husband's story and our old deaf dog's story and our neighbors' stories and our family stories and ultimately God's story. What does it mean to be part of all these different stories? And try to be a good part of those stories, an honorable part, a noble part, a part that builds up and brings beauty as opposed to creating discord or pain. I guess that's what I'm trying to do.
Okay, so that said, super humble and Jeff Chu consistent response. And yet the way that you're doing that is resonating with a lot of people out there. So for those of you who don't know Jeff Chu, and I know a lot of people do because all of my friends fan a little over you, which I think is fun and interesting and odd too, right? And we can go into that. You and your friend Sarah Bessey co-convene this amazing community called Evolving Faith. And so the way you all are talking about your own stories and the way you all have created a table in which you're inviting people who are talking about their own stories is hitting home for people where church has not necessarily felt like a safe place to do that kind of work. So can you tell us a bit about Evolving Faith and how your own personal journey has intersected with this now kind of awesome, amazing, viral, global journey within the church?
Sure. So Sarah Bessey and our late friend Rachel Held Evans, they started Evolving Faith together in 2018. Sarah came out of the Pentecostal charismatic tradition in Canada, and Rachel grew up in Bible churches in Alabama and Tennessee. And both of them wondered whether there might be a desire for a gathering of folks who are still compelled by the story of Jesus, but whose faith had shifted in some way. Sarah had to leave the vineyard because of her affirming stance towards LGBTQ people, and Rachel became an Episcopalian. And as their faith shifted, they longed to hear other people's stories of evolving faith. That's where the name comes from. Rachel thought they might get a couple hundred people in the room, right? And then they were both surprised in 2018 when tickets sold out in a couple of weeks, and the room at Montreat in North Carolina was totally packed, 1,500 people. So I was a speaker that first year, and then I joined the leadership team a few months after that. And what I learned, what I think we all learned, was that the church has too often been a place where our whole selves and our whole stories aren't fully welcomed. And by that, I mean not just our identities, not just those markers that society has put on us that makes us other, but also our doubts and our questions and our struggles. Church is not a place where most of us feel candid. where we can be comfortable being uncomfortable together. Too many churches have made idols out of certainty and conformity. And what does that say about the expansiveness of God's love or the truth of God's grace? We talk about love and grace all the time, but do we actually live it out? I think we were surprised too. It wasn't just ex-evangelicals who showed up. There was also a large cohort of folks from mainline churches who really appreciate their congregation's emphasis on justice, but who were longing for just a little bit more Jesus.
Ah, interesting. Okay.
We were surprised by that. They were totally on board with making the church and the world a more loving and inclusive place. They wanted to hear more about the stories of Scripture. They didn't want to attend the political pep rally on Sundays. They wanted Jesus. They wanted a connection with the Holy Spirit. And they had pastors, they still have pastors, who were afraid to talk about these things. So then Rachel dies at the beginning of May 2019. And that left such a void for us, losing our friend. And we honestly debated whether to keep going, mainly for personal reasons, right?
Yeah.
Because we've suffered this loss of a tremendous writer, brave public figure, but for us, she was our friend.
Yeah.
We did it because the need didn't go away. So many of us have found ourselves with a faith that is evolving in ways we never expected. And that didn't disappear with Rachel's death. The call to this work, which is not always fun, honestly, didn't disappear with Rachel's death.
Yeah. Why isn't it fun?
Why isn't
Let's
it
just
fun?
name it. Just name it.
It's not fun to try to bring a group of hurting people together.
Mm-hmm.
Hurting people who are afraid of healing because the hurt has become so familiar and in some ways so comfortable. And sometimes healing hurts too.
Yeah.
Sometimes healing stretches us in ways we're not used to being stretched because maybe those muscles have atrophied, or maybe we're forced into a kind of discomfort that we haven't known before. I think Americans especially are uncomfortable with discomfort.
Yeah.
And sometimes we mistake discomfort for danger.
Yeah. Ah, interesting.
And so we end up hurting each other because we're hurting. And that's no different in the evolving faith community than it is in the wider church. So that's a struggle sometimes. There's also, just speaking personally, that sense of responsibility, right? Who am I to dare to speak into someone else's relationship with God? That takes some arrogance, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know. I'm pretty uncomfortable with it. I'm no expert in terms of relations with the divine. As I said, I'm just a normal person trying to make sense of stuff.
Yeah.
So I don't take that for granted. And a lot of days I would just rather crawl back under the covers and go to sleep. But we don't always get to do that.
Yeah.
You preached an inspired sermon on a parable from Luke that I watched just last week in preparation for our time here together. And in that sermon, you said a parable is not a problem to be solved alone, or a formula to be grasped individually, or math proof to be worked out. A parable is a provocation. So would it be wrong for me to hear you affirming that it's possible, impossible for parables to be neutral and disembodied? And I asked that question, as a follow-up really to what you were just talking about the stories that evolving faith is making room to hold and to share. So yeah, or is it possible for parables to be neutral and disembodied, meaning as a proclaimer yourself of the gospel, is it possible for you to speak into a body of people or speak to a body of people without expecting for something to happen or change?
Look, you two preach more than I do, right? You always preach with hope, but maybe not expectation.
Mm.
You hope that something, and it might not even be what you intended to be heard, but you hope that something will move inside someone, and you hope that something that moves in the direction of God, right? I've spent most of my career as a journalist. This church stuff is relatively new to me. I only went to seminary a few years ago. As a journalist, I learned that there is no such thing as objectivity or neutrality. The three of us come from different cultural backgrounds, and we preach and we write and we show up in the world informed by those experiences, informed by the cultures in which we were brought up, as well as the cultures that have shaped our adulthoods, right? There's no way any of us can be objective or neutral. Every story is embodied because every story is told and then received through a different set of ears, a different set of eyes, a different set of experiences and sensory receptors, a different body. And every story can also be used for good and holy and uplifting purposes, as well as abused for bad and profane and discriminatory ones, right? I think that's one of the reasons it's so helpful to me when I'm thinking about the parables to remember that Jesus almost always offered them to a group of people. Jesus told these stories rarely to an individual and much more often to a community of people with different embodied experiences. And they had to work these things out in community. What did you hear that I didn't? What sparked a memory or a feeling inside of you because you've had a different experience of that thing he's talking about, whether it's a farm metaphor or a wedding banquet metaphor? How might you hear a story of scripture in a way that resonates where I might hear the same story and it stings or it hits on a nerve? And ultimately, my hope is that when we are in community, there will be someone in every group who reminds everyone else that God is love. And if we believe that Jesus was the incarnation and the embodiment of that love, then the stories that Jesus offers should point us toward collective healing and to deeper community, difficult as that might be sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
That's not neutral at all. That can't be neutral. It's definitely biased. And anytime I'm preaching, not just from the parables, but a lot of folks in the evolving faith community really have a grudge against Paul.
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean to read Paul through the lens of his broken humanity, through the tenderness of God's love, remembering that Paul suffered and hurt and is petty and obnoxious, but also kind of funny sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's not neutral at all.
I mean, can I just affirm so much of what you've said and say that it resonates for me individually, and I know for Amos and I, even as we had discussions about whether or not to include or whether or not to continue this is crucial podcast conversation, like you were saying, sometimes you just want to get back in your covers and just call it a day, because even if the work is important, it's exhausting. And especially around these conversations, these angles that the church is picking up now. And I love that you named almost this gap in the market of churches that are either peddling certainty or just justice, faith or work. No, there is the marriage of, Jesus embodies the marriage of those two things, right? the embodiment of love that is greater than what we could come up with or feel ourselves on our own. And that's why we need the community. And yet something that I struggle with is I feel like the conversation is starting to get on a loop. Like, even as we think about what questions to ask, it's kind of amazing to me that the conversation, for example, let's say around race, continues to have to be around proving that racism still exists and is real and is a problem for the church. And I'm like, how many episodes can we do on that before we're not even actually moving the conversation forward? We're just spinning over and over and over again. And so I guess my question for you, Jeff, is how do we move these conversations forward as a community? Like you said, you hope that there's someone in the room or someone at the table who like raises their hand and says, hey, don't forget God is love, right? Like, where are we getting stopped up? What are those words that we need to remind ourselves of so that we can continue forward in healing, using a word that you mentioned, where it doesn't just feel like we're talking for the sake of talking?
So I think one of the struggles, right, for preachers like the two of you, what do you get with your congregants in a week? An hour, maybe 2 hours? If they're super involved, maybe 3 or 4? Where are they the rest of the time? They're immersed in a world that rehashes the same conversations and pursues the same ends. And those ends are different than God's ends. I heard a really wonderful sermon once. It was preached by the dean at the time of Washington National Cathedral. And I honestly just expected a standard issue progressive sermon. And he got up into the pulpit of Riverside Church, a church in New York City that has such a rich history with civil rights. And he says to this congregation, your ends can't be the same as the world's ends, even if you call it justice.
Wow.
And your means can't be the same because your goals are different and the one you serve is different. I'm not sure most folks in that room were ready to hear that or to begin to process what the implications of that kind of call are. Because every day, especially those of us who are spending time on social media, we're immersed in a discourse that so often is about being right.
Yeah.
About signaling what our values are, even if we don't live them out particularly well. And they're not fundamentally, our conversations are not action. They're not doing anything to change the lives of the people who are suffering. And I'm conscious of that all the time. What am I doing in my little corner of the world that actually heals, that actually pursues the kind of flourishing that God calls the church to pursue? And it's super difficult, right? It's super difficult if our beginning, our middle, and our end is focused on the things of the world around us. And then we get an hour a week where we're like, hey, God, what's up? And I almost feel like I'm beginning to sound like my grandmother, right? Like this old Baptist woman who immersed herself in the scriptures all the time. But lately I've been thinking about how folks who used prayer books, right? Folks who read through the Psalms all the time, maybe they were able to hang on to something that we weren't because they were immersed in the full tapestry of the human experience, from the blame and the lashing out at God straight through to the praise that most of the Psalms draw us back to. They saw the full scope of the spiritual and emotional and psychological and landscape that the psalmists offered to us, which I think we're kind of afraid to do nowadays. So I feel summoned back to that. even if I don't always do it as well as I would like
to. My observation, consistent with yours, is that especially the mainline church, ones like the churches that we serve, we get stuck in loops of lament. Speaking of the Psalms, where we kind of, our proclamation sometimes sounds like we only got halfway done with the psalm. We didn't write the rest.
Stuck in Psalm 88. It ends in despair.
Yeah, and it has been I don't mean to discount at all the strangeness and terribleness of the last 3 years, and the uncertainty that's been present and all that. But I think that I remember what Willie James Jennings said. Charlene, he was one of our guests, and he said his one of his fears right now is that we've got a lot of young people with a lot of energy, but no reservoirs of hope. Like in difficult times, there's nowhere for them to draw from when the going gets tough, especially in the church. And so, yeah, it's comforting to sort of lament, but it's also exhausting to be there. Just stay in that place, hoping, not even actually hoping, just kind of swimming in those lamentable waters, and not exactly telling anybody at all that you're tired, because you kind of like it. You enjoy enjoy being right there. So that's my latest grievance, actually, that I'll just put out there into the world.
Okay, so then I share that grievance 100%. Sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, the worship service we have planned for Sunday is too joyful. There's so much going on in the world. Mm-hmm. How do we honor that? Like, we don't want to appear out of touch, and which is just like it's kind of crazy, and how to hold all of these things. I mean, I imagine it was I pictured like, what if we put the Psalms on like a scrolling feed in the same way that we had Instagram, right? Like, how would, or like Twitter or TikTok or whatever, like what would the similarities be, and what would just the stark contrasts be? So Jeff, you talked about being like, I mean, you didn't use the exact words of an agent of healing, but that's kind of what I heard in the small corner in which you are in. So, and I think that is, as for all of us, people who are that's the call of all of Christians, all of humanity, and then particularly in the work that we're doing. But my question to the two of you actually is, where have you experienced healing? Not where are you doing the healing, but where have you been healed? How have you been healed? Because I think that is a story of hope. The healing is possible.
So sometimes I have to get away from humans to find
humans.
Healing.
Yeah.
Humans kind of suck sometimes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I find healing in the garden.
Okay.
Plants know how to do what they're designed to do. That's not to say they don't face disease or obstacles to their growth, but there's something beautiful about how resilient plants are. I planted potatoes this season, and I planted some in my yard, which did okay. And then I have a plot in the community garden, and they were ravaged by these Colorado potato beetles that just devoured their leaves. And so I was like, screw it, they're dead. I go to the garden a few weeks later, and one of the plants has started to grow leaves again, and it is struggling along. And it's doing what it knows how to do, to survive. And not just survive, but thrive. So I need to go next week and dig around in the soil and see if it produced any tubers. And we can hope, we'll see. But that's really healing for me, to see how the processes that God set into motion, spring, summer, fall, winter, these plants, the butterflies, the bees, they know how to do what they were called to do.
Yeah.
And then in terms of human relationship, honestly, some of the most healing moments have been some of the most mundane things. It is meals with people whom you love and who you know love you. And sometimes you don't even say anything significant. My best friend, who's a pastor in Ann Arbor, one of my fondest memories of him is in a moment of great pain. He came and he sat next to me, didn't say a word. He was just there.
Mm.
And sometimes I think we try to fill space with words and proclamations of opinions and things that seem right, when the most right and healing thing in the world is just to be present.
Yeah. Amen. Amen. Amos?
Yeah. I don't like this question very much.
Why?
Well, one, built into the question is a presumption that like healing, like I need healing right now. And so in thinking about my answer to your question, I was like, what's broken in me, and I think even just asking that question, like what's broken that has needed healing, is just, that's for me, another like getting stuck in that loop of lament again. And I go there really easily. So it's my natural instinct really is to think about what's broken or unfinished. So I'm going to give, instead of thinking about healing, I'll just say like peace for me. What's brought peace, or even like mundane, like transcendence, that's transcendence in the everyday would be, I've started doing spelling bee on the New York Times. Yeah. So
super fun.
Yeah, I started weeks and weeks ago, but it's you can count how well you're doing. There's a goal at the end, like you can reach the genius level, and it makes you feel like, I feel really confident after I'm done with it. I don't know why, but more so than anybody telling me like, hey, you know what you're doing in life, Amos, or way to go. Just getting to genius on spelling bee just makes the rest of the day go really well for me. So, and then the other thing is, I've got right now, I shouldn't say this out loud because I'll probably jinx myself, a 68-day streak of journaling every night, which I've never done in my entire life. And that's been, it's been brought a lot of peace to me to kind of just unload, not spill my secrets out on the page, but just unload the things that I'm thinking about and not feel as if like I need to carry them into my rest, into my day's Sabbath.
I love that.
And I decided to use bullet points instead of like prose, I guess, or paragraphs.
Oh, I love that.
I know. And it's just, it was so, it was liberating to not feel as if I needed to like write incomplete sentences. And I've been able to do it primarily because of those bullet points.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's the difference? How do you differentiate peace from healing?
I think for me, there is a, peace is, for me, like an acceptance of, like my present condition, and there's a neutrality to that acceptance. Like I'm not naming it as either good or bad, ugly or beautiful, worthy or empty. In just accepting it as it is.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been easier for me to use as like an organizing principle, because when I think about healing, it feels like another to do.
Yeah. I hear you.
Like another thing that I've got to like accomplish,
Yep.
or And and most of the healing that I've experienced in my life it's never come because of something that I've done,
Of course.
It's always kind of just, it's happened. So that's the difference for me.
I mean, it's like, Jeff, you describing how the bees and the butterflies and the plants know how to do what they do well. Like, it's simple, right? They don't try to, a butterfly doesn't try to be a hummingbird, and a bee doesn't try to be an ant. And yet humanity regularly tries to be God. And humanity regularly tries to bring about healing that is, I mean, we can be agents that, like, in the same way that, let's say you have a gaping wound on your body, you should keep it clean. There are things that you can do to prevent healing, but you are not the white blood cell and your body doing the actual healing. And so much of it is surrendering, which I think right now, even to what you were talking about, Jeff, in terms of like why it's hard, why sometimes it's not fun, is this constant expectation of our participation in these things. And while I don't say like, oh, just sit back and let injustice run rampant, how do you find that balance between being recipients of grace, being participants in peace, by being receptive to healing, but not thinking that it's like, gosh, the worship service was too joyful today? Or, how do I think the lament cycle is because we feel like we have to. Mm-hmm. This is how we keep it current.
This is what mature, serious people do.
Yeah. Or people who think injustice is real. Sorry, go ahead, Jeff.
Isn't there a difference between like performative congregational lament and the genuine heart lament that comes from true pain? Mm. And I think one thing you're describing is the performative congregational lament that actually makes us feel better and makes us feel as if we have some control over the situation because we did something.
Yep.
As opposed to a heart cry to God because we do not know what else is possible. There's a real difference between the psalmist's lament, if I'm reading those words empathetically and compassionately and believing that they were inspired by true life, right? There's a difference between that and a congregation that looks at a tragedy and says, we just need to say something. So I would distinguish, first of all, between those two things. And then I guess it's the whole grace and gratitude cycle for me, which is why, even though I grew up Baptist, I've ended up in Reformed theology, because there is grace for our mistakes, which are inevitable. We will sometimes be too complacent.
Yep.
And we will sometimes be overactive and spin in unproductive ways. And maybe once in a while we might do some good. And this is where it helps, I think, to play the long game, to not put too much pressure on any one worship service or any one sermon or any one moment, because you know that a story is still unfolding.
Preach.
That's on my good days.
Yeah. I needed to hear that. Damn. I really needed to hear that today. You say, one of the things you say is, some days I believe in God and other days I want to believe in God.
And I think it's a little play on Rachel Held Evans, who wrote often on the days when I believe. Right? She wrote about the Sundays where she would sit in church and she couldn't say the Apostles' Creed. And that's when we rely on the old lady in the pew in front of us or the kid next to us to say the words that on some level we want to say, but we can't.
Yeah.
And I think that's what spiritual community is for, to carry what we can't. And sometimes you get the privilege of carrying what someone else can't.
Which is ideal, and which is so sad that you named, one of the needs that evolving faith came out of or meets is how so many people feel like they can't be honest in the church, right? Like that sentence. Some days I believe in God, and other days I want to believe in God. Like, who is that not true for? And yet, how many times do we name that in church, right? Whether it's the preacher, pastor, or the person sitting in the back of the pew, like that is the reality. I mean, Paul talks about that. Like that is scriptural. And I mean, for me, I have found healing in conversations where there has been spiritual honesty or just honesty to the point where I'm like, oh my gosh, I am not the only one who's feeling this way. So like one of those prophetic moments happened for me, and I actually immediately texted Amos afterwards. It was a lunch with you where I don't know why it was so crazy, but I continue to struggle with loneliness, deep, abiding loneliness. And instead of you saying, Jeff, like, oh my gosh, you're not lonely. Call me whenever you need to. Or like, you have like so many people who love you. Blah, blah, blah. You're like, oh yeah, I am lonely all the time. And I was like, oh, it was presence. It wasn't fixing me. It was being with me in loneliness and just saying like, yeah, like you even said like something that I'm working on is how to figure out how to be accept that loneliness will be a constant companion for me. And so that was super healing for me. And I literally texted Amos right afterwards. Okay, so here is my final question for us today, because so much of what you're talking about and so much of what I feel like the discourse in the churches right now is ironically, it's very Ecclesiastes. I know you love Ecclesiastes. It's very like, this isn't new. This isn't like, this is same old stuff that's been there since day one. And yet it's so freeing to name the things. So my question is, how has your faith, Jeff Chu, your faith, Amos DeSasa, evolved in a way that has been life-giving for you in recent seasons?
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'm just going to ramble for a bit while I get my thoughts together, but I absolutely will go first. Don't mind. Let's do a little prelude here. Little podcast prologue. Yeah, my faith as of late has evolved to be more pragmatic. Yeah.
Can you say more?
I'm just beginning to think in terms of like decades instead of like weeks, and acknowledging, I think, how little like actual control I have to alter, the 5 minutes. Like I probably got a little bit of control over the next 5 minutes, but the next 5 hours belong. Like, I mean, there are things that are going to happen that I just can't plan for, and so yeah, I would say my faith is I've become also to just appreciate and read Jesus's parables and the Gospels from a like more with a pragmatic, like hermeneutic, pragmatic lens, and I would say the result has been my prayers have gotten smaller, in the sense that they just, the words are simpler, the sentences are shorter, and I'm just asking for daily bread has kind of become the essence of my prayers, and I think that that's a feature of my faithful pragmatism these days. Is I just don't want to be disappointed by God anymore. And I think it's okay for me right now to draw near into the present and not be too concerned with next month or next year. It's new for me because Charlene will tell you I think strategically about everything.
It's hard to think strategically about how God's going to work in your life.
Yeah.
I know. I wish I'd known that. I wish I'd known that. We should have had you. Wish I'd met you, Jeff, like 5 years ago. That would have been helpful.
Jeff, I want you to give the final word. So I'm just going to give my answer real quick.
Yeah.
And I say this to you, my dear Asian brother, because I feel like you would understand. I feel like God has always been an Asian parent in my mind, where I'm not doing enough. Like it was like my mom banging the chopsticks on the table every time. It was like, take a bite. If we weren't eating fast, like all those things. It was like, pray longer, wake up earlier, study harder. And the new manifestation that I kind of know in the deep recesses of my heart is real and true, but still I have a hard time accepting it, is how God wants to like practicing the presence of God. And so before it was very much like you show up ready with your studies prepared and you're, in your Sunday best. And now it's like that friend where they're like, I want to catch up with you. And you're like, I have to go to the grocery store and I'm going to be racing around the aisles. And they're like, that's cool. Can I just come and walk beside you while you do that? And we can catch up. Like, just do what you got to do. Like, I know that you're feeling stressed and anxious, but like, I just want to be with you. And I'm like, oh, wait, what? Like that is the evolution that I'm trying to really wrap because in that is this notion of grace and unconditional love and love and love and love. So that is not something that I earned, but something that is just present constantly, is like the evolution that I'm trying to live into, but it's hard.
Because you've been brought up in a culture that values you for what you do.
Yes.
Right? To go back to where we started with my stupid resume.
Yes.
We live in a culture that cherishes productivity, and especially those of us who are living in America as people who are not white. It feels as if we constantly have to earn our belonging.
Yes.
So how do we fight that? Sometimes it feels like a losing battle. It's exhausting to have to prove, or to feel as if you have to prove over and over and over that you have something to contribute, that you have a right to be part of the community, that you're worthwhile. So I get that. I get that on a very deep level. I think my answer to your question over the last few years, look, I am a queer man in a very straight culture. And when I talk about my culture, I mean Chinese culture as well as American church culture, right? I've grown up at the intersection of conservative Chinese culture and conservative Baptist culture. Those are my roots. And coming out and dealing with the implications of that was an estrangement. In some ways, it was almost an insult to my family. And a break with what I was told were my family's values, right? Those layers of values. So in the last few years, I feel as if there's been a kind of reconciliation, not necessarily with actual people in my family, but between me and what I understand to be the values that my grandparents, who were so formative in my childhood, the values they raised me with. It's coming to a new understanding of the faith that I inherited and the ways in which those stories sustained my grandparents when they were refugees during World War II. My maternal grandmother, who was sent to work in a knitting factory when she was 12 or 13 and never given an education because her mother needed her to make money. What those ancestors found to be good news is the same thing that I need as good news now.
Yeah.
Which is to believe that God is not just real, but also present and listening and alongside us and suffering with us. And that ultimately, somewhere down the line, in a mysterious way that we can't understand right now, all things will be made new. That's not a new story.
Yeah.
And I'm glad it's not a new story. I'm glad that it sustained my grandparents and it has sustained my parents, because it gives me some hope that will also sustain me.
Hmm. That's some gospel right there. It may be because I'm reading Ecclesiastes a lot right now, but you are, I'm catching some serious Kohelet vibes from you right now, Jeff Chu. The honesty mixed with like the simple hope of like the tactile things that are right in front of us. And
eat and drink. We need to eat and drink good things.
Yes, we do. Your hospitality, your commitment to hospitality is contagious. Just even in kind of following you on Instagram or talking to you, I've been more excited about cooking and just being present.
Look
in
at
those.
You, Charlene.
Yes, I know. I mean, and like nothing is more healing than my kids looking at the plates I put before them and saying like, "This looks so good, Mama. Thank you so much." And then I'm like, that feels way better than someone being like, "That was a great sermon." Right? Because it's human and it's so like it's survival, and not just words. It's presence.
And you fed them.
Yes. I love that. Jeff, can you just plug really quickly the Evolving Faith Conference that is coming up in just a few weeks?
Evolving Faith 2022, October 14th and 15th. Charlene Hahn Powell will be one of our speakers. I'm so excited Charlene's coming, but we also have Barbara Brown Taylor and Kate Bowler and Brian McLaren and Shaniqua Walker Barnes.
Cole Arthur Riley.
Propaganda will perform a couple of poems or songs. The poet Maggie Smith will be with us. It's going to be an amazing group of people. It's all online. evolvingfaith.com. Join us. If you can't watch everything on October 14th and 15th, you'll have access to the videos through the end of the year. I think it's going to be a really rich time full of questions and challenge, but ultimately hope. That's Charlene's job, to bring the hope.
Entirely virtual. So Berkeley folks, Dallas folks, we'll put the link in all of our things. Register, sign up, get a part of it, be a part of it, join the conversation. It's a community of people who have recognized and accept that faith is an evolving and a beautiful part of our lives. And so, Jeff, thank you so much. You are a pastor to pastors. I hope you know that. There's many of us who tune in and find great wisdom and peace in the wisdom that you have to offer. So thank you.
Thanks,
Jeff. Thank you.
Good to spend time with you both.
See you all next month. Our October guest is the Reverend Dr. Scott Black Johnston. We'll be talking about his forthcoming book, Elusive Grace. Take care.
Peace. Yep.